I woke up sometime after midnight.
And I kind of remember like coming to, like I had maybe passed out or whatever, but
trying to get through that moment. You're praying, okay, I need to just get out of here. So we didn't want to run.
But after that, I was like, I want to investigate this.
For many people, the search for Sasquatch is a happenstance endeavor. People of various backgrounds and life experiences come together to search for the Sasquatch, connected by their own individual experiences with the creature. But as different as each person may be, when observed as a whole, the Sasquatch topic forms a curious through line in each one of their lives. A prime example of this is Olympic Project member David Ellis, who did not begin his own investigation into the Sasquatch phenomenon until much later in life.
I'm David Ellis. I live on Whidbey Island. My prior job experience was in the lighting industry. I worked for a large lighting manufacturer selling to distributors and contractors. So that's kind of what my work history has been. I'm currently retired, fully vested in the Bigfoot conquest, so to speak, and in the middle of writing a book about unknown sounds.
David's introduction to the Sasquatch topic was a dramatic encounter he had when he was very young.
My grandfather had an 80-acre farm near Battleground, Washington. And sometime in the late 40s, early 1950s, he had an experience that he told the grandchildren about. So I recollect I heard this story about 1958, 59, somewhere in there. Maybe 6, 7 years old at the time I heard it. And the story goes that he was cutting hay, it was in the summertime, and up jumped a 5-foot-tall monkey and ran across the field and hopped the fence and was in the woods. So from the time I'm 5, 6, 7 years old, there's been this notion that there are monkeys in the woods. So now fast forward, I'm 11 years old, it's 1963, and a group of kids from the neighborhood, we went to our local haunt, which was called the Stump Field. And it was called the Stump Field because it was logged with the old buckboard method where they would springboard and go up about 12 feet in the air and then chop the tree down from that, leaving these large edifices behind. And the reason they did that is they wanted straight timber. So there's this 140-acre field that we would go to that would have these big, tall edifices, and we could hide and we could play all sorts of fun games. So it was a great little place for us to while our hours away. It was a Saturday afternoon, maybe 4 o'clock-ish or so in the afternoon. There were cows that we had to kind of negotiate, and for some odd reason, we thought it was peculiar, but they were all huddled down in one corner of the field. So as we get to the other side of the field, one of the kids picks up a stick and whacks a overhanging limb of a large maple tree, and from there, all heck went crazy. We really couldn't see too much inside of the fence line because there was so much brush, but I could see that there were alder trees and they were doing this. And I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The next thing that I recollect is I thought maybe something was tumbling out of the trees at first, but then I realized no, limbs were being snapped off of the tree, maybe 2-inch size limbs, and about 12 feet up in the air. And I couldn't fathom what I was seeing. And then something cut loose with a scream that I later described to my dad as an elephant trumpeting and a lion roaring all at the same time. And this vocalization lasted 10 to 12 seconds. It was really long. And I kind of remember like coming to, like I had maybe passed out or whatever, but whatever that vocalization was, I was less than 50 feet from the source. And it was overpowering, so it just literally knocked us to the ground. And when it stopped, I can remember kind of coming to and just yelling, "Run!" And away we went. That was my experience with something that was unknown. And then the following week, we had a library class. And in that library class, the librarian would ask us, usually, did anything interesting happen over the weekend? Up shot my arm like a rocket, and I told the story of what we just heard, and she thanked me for such a colorful story, and yeah, have a seat. And then about 30 minutes later, when the class was all reading a book, I feel this tap on my shoulder, and it was Mrs. Holcomb, the librarian, and she said, "David, I want you to come talk with me for a minute." So I went with her, and I thought, well, oh God, now what? Am I in trouble or whatever? And then she opens up with, "Now, can you tell me a little bit more about that scream that you heard? Do you think it could have been one of the cows down at that you said that was in the field?" "No, I know what a cow sounds like." "Could it have been a cougar? You said it had a kind of a high-pitched scream." "No, I know what a cougar sounds like." And the more that I described it, the more she started nodding her head. And then she says, I think I have a book for you to read." She said, "It's an adult book, but it was just published a couple years ago, and I think it may have answers for you." And that book was Ivan T. Sanderson's Abominable Snowman, Legend Come to Life. It was published in '61, and my experience was in '63. So how my librarian knew about this book, makes me wonder what she knew. Because she said it would have answers for me, and it did. So that's kind of how I have grown an interest in the subject. It wasn't an obsession like it is now. It was an interest. And then, of course, when the Patterson-Gimlin film came out, I was all behind that. I could tell just by looking at the movement that wasn't a man in a suit.
At the age of 15, David had been exposed to not only the most famous film footage of a Sasquatch, but also one of the seminal works of Sasquatch research with Ivan Sanderson's book. It would seem that he was prime for a lifetime of Sasquatch research, but this was not the case.
First there was girls, then came marriage, then came kids, and get kids through college. So it was kind of after all of that I was following things on the internet. There was lots of different blogs, and I think there was Henry Franzoni's Internet Bigfoot Conference page that I went to quite a bit. The BFRO had stories that I loved to filter through. So that kind of rekindled my interest. And it wasn't until 2005 when I decided, okay, that's it. I'm going to a conference and I'm going to see what this stuff is all about. So I did, and got to rub shoulders. And it was so funny. We were in a meet and greet line, and in front of me was Bob Gimlin. And I went, "That's Bob Gimlin," to my kids. And I'm, starstruck, eyes this big. "Bob Gimlin, that's Bob." And Tom Yamarone, he saw that I couldn't take my eyes off of Bob, and he goes, "Excuse me, do you want to meet Bob?" Well, of course I want to meet Bob. So yeah, I got to meet Bob. And so now I'm all starstruck. And then at the conference, is one right after another of people that I've been following on the internet, telling their stories, telling why this is real to them. And then, Dr. Meldrum just kind of cemented the whole thing with as much evidence on foot morphology as you could handle. And the whole thing really inspired me to the point where I called Tom Yamarone about 4 or 5 months later, and I said, "Tom, I got to get out into the field. I got to find out what everybody's seeing and hearing and experiencing." And he says, I got a few people for you. And he sent me to Paul Graves, was one of the people, and then Christine Walls. I got to meet Christine, and the group is called Washington Bigfoot Research, WOBFR. They helped me get into the field and take me to places where they had experiences, and I started to have my own experiences. So it just kind of blossomed from there.
David's personal journey into Sasquatch research eventually led him to joining the Olympic Project in 2010. While many in the community now consider him to be an audio specialist, David's skills extend further than just audio analysis, and he has been involved with the collection of multiple tracks and other pieces of evidence over the course of his involvement. The one aspect of all this research that stuck out to David more than the rest, however, was the aspect of audio recording and analysis.
Going back to the WOBFR days, when I was working with them, there was 3 or 4 folks that were using what's called a bionic dish, which is a method of enhancing audio from the environment. It gives you an ability to hear more clearly and some of the softer sounds at a distance. Sounds we couldn't hear without using this particular device. And they were hearing things in the brush moving around, and that just enthralled me to no end. In the year 2006, my kids gave me a bionic dish as a Christmas gift. So between Christmas and New Year's, we went to a location that we were having all kinds of activity. And usually the activity involved, when you got there, a wood knock that would announce your presence or that you were there. I had this bionic dish, and I could hear sounds and things that were going on that others could not. And I was hearing something that was walking, starting at my 1 o'clock and then into my 2 o'clock and then to my 3 o'clock. But there was also something that was at the 12 o'clock that was doing the knocking sounds as well. Something was trying to get behind us, near as I could tell. We would move forward, and when we would do that, there would be this rapid fire wood knocking. Bam, 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 bam. So we stopped, and that whatever it is still moving behind us, and we moved forward again, and then the same thing, bam, 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 bam. Like it was not very excited that we were coming closer. So we decided that, hey, we're probably upsetting whatever that is, and that we should maybe give it some relief and leave the area, which we did. But that's just a story that I can tell you. That wasn't recorded. So you have to take my word that I heard what I did. And I thought, that's not very scientific. The way that this should work is I should get that recorded. So that week, I went out and bought a digital recorder, and then I figured out how to run audio to a recorder and also monitor it in the field at the same time. So the following week, went back to that location, hoping to get, lightning to strike twice. As I'm putting my gear together, the researcher that's with me says, "Did you hear that?" And I said, "No." And she said, "I just heard a wood knock." So now I'm scrambling really fast to get the gear all together. And we jump into the wood line. She grabs some rocks and starts hitting the rocks together. And we got a response, like right away. And then, so we got a back and forth interchange, and I'm recording all of this.
Another one. Are you moving?
Yeah. I'm gonna hit rocks.
Okay.
I'm gonna hit bigger rocks.
It just answered.
Yeah.
Try it again.
And I'm just ecstatic. You can hear yells, you can hear screams. I was just literally beside myself because now, besides this story, I have actual proof that that happened. So that was really exciting. So from then on, I just kept working on my gear, trying to get better gear, get better recording equipment, and kind of got a reputation around witnesses and other researchers. And so that just inspired me to keep doing more and more and more. But it wasn't until I started working with witnesses and convinced them that if they were to record every night, we would have way more data. So it ended up being the case. I started working with all kinds of different witnesses, and they would record overnight. And now I volumes of audio recording are coming my way. And it got to the point where I couldn't keep up with it. And I had heard this gentleman that goes by the name of Monongahela in the Bigfoot world. And he is a cryptolinguist trained by the government to identify sounds. So he and I started conversing back and forth, and he got me to understand that reviewing audio visually through a spectrogram is the way to go. Because I was complaining to him that, Mono, I'm reviewing this audio and I've fallen asleep. Because it's a 1 for 1. It's 1 minute of recording and 1 minute of listening. So, thousands of hours adds up, and you just don't have that kind of time. So he explained to me the advantages of going that route, which I ended up doing, learning how to review audio visually and correlate sounds that are suspicious to possible biological animals that could make these sounds, and got to the point where I'm now comparing through the use of the Macaulay Library of Sound catalog. If I thought maybe this could be a coyote, I would go and review coyote audio and learn the voice prints, if you will, that coyotes, when they make a vocalization, what those sounds look like. Not only what you hear, but what you see. And that became very, very, very powerful tool to me. And so once I started doing that, my analysis, I'm spending the same amount of time, but I'm covering so much more territory and learning so many things.
Unbeknownst to David at the time, his work analyzing audio and spectrogram would go on to inspire many researchers and reshape the way the Sasquatch community approaches audio research. One such researcher is Chris Spencer, whose own introduction to the Sasquatch topic also happened at a young age.
As a kid, I wanted to believe in Bigfoot, but I kind of took my dad's stance. My dad was extremely skeptical. But it was always cool to think about Bigfoot. my mom always told me, you never know what's out there. We don't know everything. So I was intrigued with the stories and stuff growing up. And I've told you about the experience I had with my dad in Packwood. But it wasn't until like the early 90s when I went to college and I took Anthropology 101. I had Grover Krantz as a professor. I had no idea that he had anything to do with the subject. And evidently, he would devote one lecture a year to the topic of Sasquatch. I walked into the classroom and there was the Gigantopithecus skull that he recreated, plus a bunch of casts on the counter. And I was like, what the heck's going on? And he proceeded to give a lecture on the topic. He went through how he recreated the Gigantopithecus skull, went through Cripplefoot cast and what his thoughts were on that. And then he had the Patterson-Gimlin film. He had, I think, a third generation copy, and he actually played it on a projector. And up to that point, I'd seen it on TV. And back, in the 70s and 80s, TV was not that great. So you had this jerky footage on not great TV. It looked like a guy in a suit. And that's what my dad said, that's a guy in a suit. But when I watched an actual copy of the film on screen on the projector and Grover went through it, I left that lecture believing that animal was real. And he explained it perfectly. The other thing I was in awe was here you had an actual accredited scientist interested in this topic and validating it. And that's, I would say, that lecture is what changed my opinion on the subject. From that point on, I absolutely believed they were real. And I started following the topic a little bit more. So.
In a similar fashion to David Ellis, Chris didn't get involved with the Sasquatch subject until much later than his initial exposure to it.
I followed it like everybody else, and in the late 2000s, YouTube was really becoming a thing, and I started watching YouTube. And of course, the podcasts were coming on, and I started listening to Sasquatch Chronicles like everybody else. And I was interested in it. I really liked the idea of doing the audio recording because I'd heard David Ellis talk about it a number of times. But, I wasn't like going to go out in the field looking for it. But I want to say 2011, I'd been fishing Rife Lake with a friend, and we had an experience where there were some knocks on shore. And Rife Lake, you have the Gifford Pinchon National Forest butts up to the south end of it. And we'd been fishing for smallmouth, and we'd had something large breaking branches and moving along the shore as we were just trolling down the shore throwing buzz baits. When we had stopped for a while, we fished, and something knocked when we went to leave a half an hour later or so. But that was intriguing to me, and that's when I found the BFRO. And I actually filled out a report for that, and I talked to a BFRO guy. But anyways, fast forward to 2013, I was definitely into the subject. I was following it, but I wasn't actively doing anything on my own. In 2013, my son and I, he was 13 years old. I'd gotten him a 2-man tent for Christmas from Walmart, and he wanted to go camp in it for spring break. And his spring break started April 5th. It was raining. It was a cold year. Snow level was probably 2,000 feet, and it was raining over on the west side. I said, well, we'll jump on Highway 14 and we'll go east and find a campground east to camp on. And we came to Skamania County Campground. Weather was better, and it had opened April 1st, and we were the only people there. It's basically a sliver of timber, 3 to 5 acres. You got the Columbia River on one side, and then you got Highway 14 on the other side, and there's actually a baseball field behind it. Well, we set up the tent and just did a little walk. We camped right next to the river, and we walked up the river, and we came to a spot where someone had walked down to the river, and there was an old degraded track. And ironically, my son was like, oh, look, Dad, Bigfoot. And we kind of laughed about it. And we walked up into the timber, and there's a little trail that went back to the camp, and we started walking that trail. And as we were walking that trail, I was noticing freshwater clams, and they were all open and clean, just laying piled up on this trail. And they weren't broken or chewed on. And I thought it was odd. It could have very well been like crows or even, some kind of corvid bird dragging them back there. But usually you find them broken, usually you find them chewed on. But I noted it, and we start heading back to camp, and we kind of come around a bend, and there was a vine maple that was 6 feet up, and it was twist broke and wrapped around this fir tree, this old fir tree. And right below it, in the fir needles, was an impression that you could see toes in. And that's when we're like, wow, this is crazy. We went and got my tape out of my Jeep, and that print was 18 by 9. And so now we're like, okay, this is interesting. And we started looking around the camp, and we found another 18 by 9 impression in the leaves. And these were just impressions. They weren't, I never even thought of casting them, but it was all fresh stuff. And we found some other trees that were broken off at the top that was just really weird. Well, we were excited because that limb twist was cool, and that impression in the fir needles, I took a picture of it, was impressive. I mean, you could definitely see the heel, and you could see toes in the fir needles. Well, we went fishing after that, and we're excited about it, and came back to camp. And while we were roasting hot dogs, it started sprinkling. So I had 2 small blue tarps and some paracord, and his Walmart tent didn't have a rain fly, so I tied those up in a way that it covered us so we wouldn't get wet. It got dark, and Jameson went to bed about 9:30, and I was getting creeped out, admittedly, because I started, everything's cool and exciting when it's light out, but as soon as it's dark out and we're literally the only people there, it was getting creepy. And I finally went to bed, and Jameson was out. I woke up sometime after midnight to movement around the camp, and my first thought was elk. Because the snow level was still so low, I know the elk would go down and feed in that baseball field and be down around close to town. And so my first thought was there's elk moving in there, but it didn't sound like elk. It was just ever so often some movement. And just as I was about to fall asleep again, something grabbed the tarp from one of the tarps and started pulling on it, and those tarps were moving back and forth. And I just sat up and I cursed. And Jameson woke up, and I told him, oh, it was just a bad dream, go back to sleep. And he did. And I sat there, and because I was right on the cusp of falling asleep, I laid there and I was telling myself, did I really hear what I heard? Because I'm like, you're psyching yourself out, you're thinking about that limb twist and that track. And I was just at that point where I'd talked myself out of it and kind of starting to relax a little bit. And it happens again. And this time, though, I had the fob to the Jeep. I hit the panic button and set off the horn and the lights. Woke Jameson up again. I was like, it was an accident, go back to sleep. I didn't go back to sleep after that. And I sat there. Nothing ever approached the tent. And that's the thing. I didn't hear any movement approaching our tent when this happened, which you would think you would. But after that, nothing happened near the tent again, but I would ever so often hear brush movement or movement in the campground. And at one point, I actually heard splashing in the water. And I'll be honest, I was so scared, I was actually shaking. I'm fighting with myself in my head, get out of the tent, and I had my handgun with me. But I couldn't do it. I was just I totally freaked myself out. Well, it was around 4 a.m. There was 2 knocks. I used to say 1, but I went back and actually looked at my notes the other day, and that's a testament how bad your memory is. There was actually 2 knocks, and they were power knocks. It sounded like a rock hitting a tree right behind our tent, not far at all. And I sat there, and for whatever reason, about 10 minutes after that, I was like, this is silly. I'm getting out of the tent. I got out of the tent. I built up the fire, and I waited for Jameson to get up. And when he got up, I asked him, I go, what'd you hear last night? He goes, I heard you cussing, and then I heard the horn on the Jeep going off. And then I told him what I heard, and he just looked at me and said, Dad, I don't want to stay here again. And I'm like, we're not. We packed up and we left. But after that, I was like, I want to investigate this. I'd listened to Shane, I'd listened to David, and I was like, I'm going to go out there and I'm going to put a recorder. I'm going to find a place to record because I like that idea. That was 2013. I spent all of 2014 ambulance chasing, as they call it. I went to the BFRO public site and I was chasing reports that were around Skamania County, mainly because that's where I had my experience. And it was close to the end of 2014. I was actually on my way home, and I was driving up through the mountains and coming out around on the backside of St. Helens, and it dawned on me, it's like, you dummy, you know where the elk herds congregate in the winter. You get huge elk herds on the north side of Mount St. Helens in the Toutle. It's the North Fork of the Toutle River. There's actually a mountain range, it's called the Toutle Range, that runs between the North and South Fork of the Toutle. I know in the wintertime the elk congregate down there, and there's usually a large die-off, because the elk, at that point in time, the elk herd was so big, the state was even having issues because they weren't getting enough food. And I was like, well, if I was an apex predator, that's where I'd be hanging out, especially in the wintertime, because you have a lot of die-off. And then in the spring, you also have calves being born, and bears regularly prey on calf elk, and as well as cougars. So I'm like, well, if there are Sasquatch around, they're going to be around those elk. So I think it was February of 2015, I went into an area called X1, and I started leaving a Tascam recorder out and visiting. I was up there twice a week through 2017, doing recording and just hiking the area, and actually recorded some stuff, and basically that's what started it.
The location known as X1 was Chris's first dedicated research location, and almost immediately the area showed signs of a variety of activity. Located near Mount St. Helens, Chris took me to the location to share some of those experiences in the same spot where they happened.
So in 2015 February, I decided I was going to start coming into this area to try recording, because I knew a lot of elk were in this area, especially in the wintertime and in the spring. As I was walking down here by myself, I had my little Sony digital recorder. I got down here, and it was a warm, for February, there was no snow on the mountain. It was a warm, dry year. And about 11 in the morning, I get right about where we're at now, and this coyote starts just scream howling, just constantly. I know now what it was. It was doing a warning scream howl. But as I got further down the road here to the bend, there's a marsh right there. It was coming towards me, and it freaked me out. And I decided to leave. I called a friend, and he's like, yeah, get out of there. And he said he'd come up with me the next day. But it was just one of those instances I was just freaked out. But there was a coyote warning location call in the middle of the day, and the coyote was just repeatedly scream howling. Well, after that, we came back the next day and started hiking around, and I picked out my first stump, which is right down here, put a recorder up, started recording here. And where we're going right now, the first suspect thing I ever recorded was in March, about a month after I started recording, and it was a power knock. There was definitely no one up here when it occurred, and it was cool. And from there on, that's when I started coming here on a weekly basis for about 2 years. Pretty much every weekend I was up here. You'll notice that it's an old growth stump. This used to be a cedar and pine forest before it got logged in the early 20th century, early 1900s. So there's all these old growth cedar stumps and white pine stumps around this area. And at the top of them, there's red huckleberry growing out of every one of them. But when I first started, that's where I would stick my recorder in the middle of one of these stumps. And this was X1A. And I recorded some stuff here, but like I said, we can't go down to X1B anymore. It's off limits. But X1B is where a lot of stuff happened. And what reason I moved down to X1B, I tried all over in this area, but X1B, that seemed to be the focus of where our target subjects were hanging out, and there's a marsh right above it and a bunch of cedars between another marsh below it, and there was a big stump in the middle that I would put the recorder in. But the reason I started recording there is in early May, up to May I had gotten some knocks, and I got a couple suspect stuff that was distant stuff, wasn't sure, vocalized. Now I'm pretty sure it was probably coyote, but I was getting some knocks every so often. But me and a friend of mine, Ryan Williams, he's an iron worker like me. We both were kind of laid off between jobs at the time, so he did a lot of hiking with me. We came in, I'd put a recorder out on the side of this trail, and it's a road now, but it was just a trail by this particular marsh. And as we're walking in from this point, we started hearing this whistling. And it sounded like another human being whistling down in this general area. And Ryan's like, is someone down there? And I'm like, there was no one else parked where you can park to come in here because it's a gated area. And for about 20 minutes as we walked down, we would hear these whistles. And luckily my recorder, which was down there, was still going, so I captured the whistles. And it sounds like a person, but they're just like monotone 2 and 3 note whistles. And it sounded like a little kid who just learned how to whistle and didn't know any tunes. And that was like 9 in the morning. And so that's when I labeled that marsh area X1B. We got to the recorder, heard the last whistle, and I turned to Ryan and I go, well, we can either go towards the whistles, which was back on the other side of this marsh in this cedar grove, or we can walk away and see if it follows us. And Ryan goes, let's see if it follows us. And I was just as nervous as him because it was just odd, it was bizarre. And so we walked out, nothing happened. We never heard anything. But 3 weeks later, we walked back in there where we'd heard the whistles. Okay, once again, we're behind the marsh over there where the track was found and the game camera is. We're in the timber, and we wanted to come back through here because this is where we assumed the whistling was coming from. But here's a big bed. Something laid down right here. Got all these ferns dead inside of it. And we found this area where something had pulled up the entire root wad of 3 big fern plants, picked all the ferns off, and there was like a mat of ferns on the ground between 2 trees. Just an odd place for... I don't see an elk laying on this hill like this. It's just odd, and there's no other beds around it. And you got all these, look at all these ferns that are obviously they've been broke and laid down in it.
Don't theorize it could be a bedding type situation?
It's probably all perfectly natural.
Is that what old ferns?
It's just weird, those ferns have been ripped up and put in there. One fern frond was actually up in the tree, like 8 feet up, but it was just like someone made a little sit-down spot of ferns right behind this marsh. Yeah, there's the end. It's been ripped off. It's been put in here. It's been broke off and put in here. All these dead ferns were put in here. I don't know that deer and elk do that. And I did go through it looking 3 weeks after the fact, looking for hares, and the only hares I found I sent to Cindy Dose, and they end up being elk and deer. But it was just one of the oddest things I've ever seen, and it was right where we were hearing those whistles come from. And that's what started. I recorded 8-fit in that same general area. Multiple times walking in here had stuff happen. I came in by myself, which I never liked coming in here by myself, but I came in by myself, and I'd actually come down the trail over here after walking through the marsh up there. And as I was over there, I heard the elk calling, and this was early July, and they'd calved late. So there was a lot of calves in here, and you'd hear them, I called them squeakers, you hear them calling back and forth, and I could hear the elk moving through this timber between that trail and this trail, and I was coming to this trail, so I'm above it, and I hear the elk running through the brush in the forest, and I hear the squeakers, the calves calling, and then I get down to this bend to turn to go down this trail, and everything goes quiet. And I had this Air Pro video camera at the time, and at this time I didn't wear a recorder on the back of my head. I had my recorder stuffed in my hoodie pocket right here, which doesn't do any good at all. And I'm holding this Air Pro camera talking about the elk. And I get about 50 yards down this trail, and it dawns on me everything's quiet. And about the time it's dawning on me everything's quiet, up on the hillside over here,
what the f was that?
and I just froze. If you watch the video, I sit in the same spot. I stand there for 2 minutes and 36 seconds and I don't move. And I say, what the F is that? And I'm talking to myself and I'm like, it's got to be a bear.
Hey, bear.
It wasn't a bear. And I'm like, I really want to get to my game camera and recorder. So I actually, holding the Air Pro, I pulled out my 357 and started walking down the trail finally after standing there forever.
Wow. I hope audio picked that up. I don't know what that was. I've never heard that in my entire life. Hey, bear. Or whatever you are that made that noise. How about you stay up there and let me go check my game camera? And I won't go up there and bug you.
I didn't get more than another 50 yards. It took me a long time. I was walking slow. I got another 50 yards down and I heard heavy movement, stomping and brush movement above me, but also below me, so that I had two somethings on either side of me. And at that point, the light switch went off in my head and I was like,
Okay, this. I'll check the game camera Friday. I'm gonna go. I ain't going back here anymore. There's stuff moving on both sides of the road now. I'm leaving.
and I hiked straight back up here. I was really scared, honestly.
Hey, the elk are down there. It's gotta be. But something else was up here and it freaking... I don't even know how to describe it. It was like a man grunting, but it was loud. And I got shit moving around me now. Picked a good day to come by myself, evidently. Holy.
So I don't know what I encountered down there. Well, I'm pretty sure it was Sasquatch, but it wasn't the elk that yelled at me, and they didn't stomp around me. But that was probably one of the most intense experiences, and I don't think I would come in by myself to this point, but I would never walk down to X1B again after that by myself. And some other stuff happened. Interesting, a lot of times when stuff would happen that we would actually hear is when I had a female with me. I had a gal that I was dating at one point. We came in here and there was a power knock. Another gal who was just a friend. We were coming out of here one year, I think it was 2016, and we had rocks thrown at us from above and they hit the tree. Rebecca and I came in here the first time I brought her in here. She'd gone off trail just for a second to take a leak, and as she's coming back to me, there's a sharp, just one whistle, and she looked at me, she goes, elk, and I'm like, yeah, shaking my head because it wasn't an elk and it was really close to us. I don't know, it seems like a long time ago now, but it's kind of cool being here right now. The place still gives me the creeps. It always did. I never felt comfortable here. Even with people, I've never been in X1 and not felt a little iffy.
The forest around St. Helens covers a swath of several hundred square miles and is located in Skamania County, the county with the highest number of reported Sasquatch sightings in Washington state, according to the BFRO website. One such report was investigated by none other than Rebecca Slick.
So I took a report on the BFRO for a Sasquatch sighting or Bigfoot sighting out here. There were some people coming back from one of the overlooks late at night, and there's a whole bunch of bridges on this road, and on one of the bridges, as they were coming down in the dark, they saw something in the middle of the bridge, and it wasn't a bear. Clearly wasn't a bear. And the one girl starts yelling, monkeys don't live here, monkeys don't live here, as they're driving past something with its arm up in the headlights as they go by it. And that happened in 2014, and I didn't see the report until years later. Turns out that was around the same time period that Chris was researching in the same general vicinity, and he found that interesting because of the size of it that was described. It was a smaller Bigfoot, and he's always thought that the area that he was researching, there might be a juvenile involved. So it was just really interesting that that was the exact same time period. The lady hadn't reported it until a year later, and then I didn't find the report until a few years later after that. So at the same time he was researching, there was other activity going on.
You interviewed the lady?
I did. Yep.
And she seemed credible?
Yes, definitely. And I actually she was able to get me in contact with the passenger in the car as well. So I was able to speak to both of them on the phone and put all the pieces together. So.
Always seen in the field together, it is difficult to imagine Rebecca or Chris investigating independently. Yet both of them started in just that way. As is the case with many people, Rebecca's path led to a life of Sasquatch research in a very natural, yet unplanned way.
I don't know how old I was, but I was little. I was growing up in Western Pennsylvania, but my dad's family would come out to the West Coast pretty much every year to visit family and do road trips during the summer. And over the years, he had picked up stories about Bigfoot, and specifically he talked about the story of the female Bigfoot that would kidnap children and throw them in the basket on her back. And so that was scary as kids, and we didn't really think of it as a real creature. These were Native American stories that he'd picked up while traveling. I don't think we really took it too seriously. He talked about how there were some Bigfoot sightings in our area in Western Pennsylvania, but then he also clarified with, well, but those people were on drugs in the 70s. And so, oh, okay, we just wrote it off. He also talked about the Yeti. And for some reason, I feel like growing up, we latched onto the Yeti more than Bigfoot. I think because it was something in another country and that made it really fascinating. Meanwhile, we had the Chestnut Ridge right there and didn't even realize the significance of it. Yeah, just little kids running around pretending we were growling outside the tents trying to scare each other as kids while camping. But we didn't really take it too seriously. It wasn't really part of our lives other than that.
In the car, you said you met Stan Gordon?
That was later on. That was, he was speaking at the Greensburg Library. My sister and I went and got to listen and chat with him. That was neat because I'd read one of his books. I was in my 20s then. I had started to have some interest in Bigfoot after kind of putting together, I guess you could call encounter. It was a situation while hiking that I wasn't sure at the time what it was, and then later on learning about Bigfoot, put together that it was kind of standard Bigfoot behavior. And so I started reading into things and came across his stuff. And I didn't even really, at that point, know the significance of Pennsylvania with Bigfoot until later moving out here. I just hadn't put it all together yet, all the information.
Well, do you mind talking about that experience you had in Pennsylvania?
In 2005, I was hiking in West Virginia and honestly just went out with someone for a picnic on this overlook. Beautiful valley, you could see the bridge from there, and stayed too long, hadn't packed flashlights, started walking back in the dark, just enough moonlight. We're like, okay, we can see the trail, we're good. Started hearing movement in the woods below us because we're hiking on a ridge, and off to this direction we're hearing movement that was sounding a lot louder than just a deer. And I grew up on a farm, so I'm running through all the scenario of, okay, is someone's horse out, someone's cow, you know, we don't have elk out here, just going through all the different animals. And then it starts clearly being footfalls like a very large person. Very heavy footfalls. And every time we would stop so that we could hear it better, we'd hear one more and then it would just be silence. And so we'd go a little further and we'd hear that and we'd stop, one more footfall, silence. And then after a while, we started hearing, for lack of a better term, speech. And it wasn't anything intelligible. It wasn't any kind of language that you know, that I'd ever heard on a movie, ever learned in school. It was nothing. It didn't sound normal. And the only thing I could think of at that moment, unfortunately, at the time, was that it was demonic because of how guttural and how menacing it sounded. And at the time, thinking it was demonic, it was like you're just trying to get through that moment. You're praying, okay, I need to just get out of here. So we didn't want to run in case it was some animal. And we ended up running into some people that I guess were going to stargaze or something that had headlamps on. It was a group of about 15 people with flashlights. We probably looked like we'd seen a ghost because of how worked up we were. Because at that point, before we saw those people, the whole way going down that trail, I actually thought we might die because I did not know what to expect just because of how evil it sounded. And I don't even think we talked about it on the way home. I mentioned to one other friend who had hiked there before,
what had happened, and she said, "Oh, I've heard demonic screaming in that same area." I was like, "Okay, I don't need to go there again. I'm going to write this off as just some kind of really creepy experience I never want to have again. I'm never going to go there." And I just kind of wrote it off and tried not to think about it for a lot of years. And then I heard the Sierra sounds, and the one that they call the samurai chatter was the closest that hearing that took me right back to that moment and actually made me have to deal with everything that I had filed away from that. And it got me interested in what it was. And the more I read, the more interested I got in it, and eventually heard of the Olympic Project. And that's why when I got to come out here for an expedition, I was so thrilled. And I don't know, I'm so glad that happened that way. I am not happy about the experience the way it happened, but I think it led me here. And there's so many wonderful friendships that have come from that. And you can't put a price on that. So I don't know. It was worth it in the end.
For many people, this experience alone would have been enough to drive them away from the topic of Sasquatch entirely. But it only speaks volumes on Rebecca's bravery that she began to dive deeper into the subject.
Well, I was still in Pennsylvania when I was reading all the books and starting to find the groups online that were doing things. Believe it or not, I was just starting to get access to the internet outside of the library. And so I started trying to read everything, and I heard about the Olympic Project, and I had family that was living out here and came out to visit. They had already been to an Olympic Project expedition. There was going to be another one, so they took me along, and I got to meet people and hike around up on the OP property and up behind there and everything. And that was really neat because there was a little bit of that factor of, oh, these are people I've heard about and they're doing great things, and the nests had just been discovered. And so there was all that going on around that. And I got to talk with Derek. I had just been reading a whole bunch of Bigfoot books. I had tried to concentrate on finding things like John Green and Dr. Bindernagel and people like that. I was showing a lot of interest in Bigfoot in general, but wanting to help out somehow, and just, I don't know, we were just talking for a while. Eventually I became a member, and eventually I got to actually got to go to the nests, and then just kind of fell into doing this with them. So it's been pretty fascinating, and just kind of, I'm still surprised sometimes how it happened.
As part of the Olympic Project, Rebecca is one of the few people who study the nest area on a regular basis. Additionally, her skills in plant and animal identification have been an essential element of the team. However, I believe her greatest contribution to the group are her documentation practices. While many members of the Olympic Project record audio and take handwritten notes, no one has gone as far as documenting the daily practices of Sasquatch researchers as Rebecca has. During the course of creating this series, Rebecca has provided me with hours of footage that she's filmed over the years, capturing important events and situations as they happen, lending credibility to the other members' stories. More so than just basic documentation, however, Rebecca's camera work displays clear intentionality in framing and subject matter, revealing a natural talent for filmmaking. Without her contributions to the Olympic Project, much of this series would not have been possible. Although the majority of her documentation work has been shown in the episodes regarding the nests, it wasn't long after relocating to the Pacific Northwest that she began to work closely with Chris and lend her documentation talents to the area of X1. In the next episode, we'll take a look at some of the incredible audio recorded at X1, as well as a piece of potential video evidence captured in the area. The study of Sasquatch is no easy task, even more so if you're by yourself. But this subject has an interesting way of drawing people together. Friendships and camaraderie now exist between the most unlikely people. And as long as each new generation builds on the last, and people come together to find an answer to this mystery, we'll keep moving along the road to discovery.